She spent the first day going through her home, packing all her belongings, putting them into boxes. On the second day, she watched the moving company take all of the belongings that she had in this lovely home to her new place. On the third day, the house was empty, and so she sat down at just a makeshift table to enjoy one final meal of shrimp, a nice Chardonnay, and a jar of caviar. And then she walked around the house, stuffing half-eaten shrimp into all of the curtain rods, along with some caviar, locked up the door and left forever. A few days later, her ex-husband and his new, very young girlfriend came to the home, and all was bliss for a few days. And then they noticed that there was this smell that was happening around the house, and they couldn't find this smell. And they checked everything. They cleaned, they mopped, they vacuumed. Nothing. They sent out gas canisters. They brought in people to do all the cleaning they could. They even had to replace the expensive wool carpeting, but that smell was there. People eventually just stopped coming over to the house. It was embarrassing. The maid quit. Finally, they couldn't take the stench any longer, and so they had to move out. They finally made the decision to sell the home. They cut the price in half. That didn't work. Real estate agents refused to list the house because it just stank so bad. Finally, they had to borrow a whole bunch of money just to buy another home and move there. Then the ex-wife called the man, asked how things were going, and he told her about the saga of this rotting house, and she listened politely and said that she really loved that house. She missed that house, and she was willing to reduce the divorce settlement if he were to sell her the home. Now, he, not realizing that she knew how bad it was, decided that he would sell the home at 1/10 the listing price if she would buy it immediately. She called her lawyer, called up the bankers, made sure everything was done, wired the money, and then it was done. A week later, the man and his girlfriend, they watched the moving truck pack all the belongings and take it off to the new home, including the curtain rods. Today's message is going to challenge you. You're going to find things you won't agree with, nor should you. We're going to talk about the church, our faith, and what it means to be a follower of Christ. Today's message is also going to push you a bit. And this is intended. I would not be doing my job if we were not always uncomfortable at times. As we talked about in this sermon series, the church is at a cusp, using the reference of a few weeks ago of canoeing. You see, we've gotten really good at canoeing the river. And extending this analogy to the church, we've gotten really good at doing church a certain way. But as I mentioned in the book, Canoeing the Mountains, so did Lewis and Clark. They were really good at canoeing the Mississippi River. They knew how to do that. Things were going fine. They were very comfortable with doing that. And then they came around the bend, and their plan was to canoe all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and they realized there was these Rocky Mountains right there. And when they encountered the Rocky Mountains, they didn't have a reference point for them. They didn't know what they were going to do. And so literally, eventually what they had to do was they had to take their canoe over the mountain. So like the core of Discovery, we've got a choice. We can turn back. We can continue to look for a river passage through the mountains, or we can learn at what is around us, pick up on what is successful, and ultimately canoe the mountains. Of course, that means a challenge. It means doing things differently. It means doing something hard, but believing that in the end, it will lead to something great. Oh, and there's one more thing about today's message. You might not like it because it's true. The truth. And sometimes the truth hurts. There's a story about a man that went on vacation, and he asked his mom to come over and take care of his cat. Of course, she did that. She came over. And just to make sure, the man invited his neighbor to just check on the mom, check on the house, check on the cat. And the neighbor said that would be fine. And so the man, feeling really good, left on the plane and went to Mexico for some needed R&R. And after a few days, he called up his neighbor and he asked how things were going. And his neighbor says, well, the cat died. And the guy says, geez, you just have to drop it like that? I'm on vacation. Then the guy said, couldn't you just kind of do it slowly? Say like first the cat was on the roof. And then say that the cat fell off the roof. And then a day later say that you took the cat to the vet. And then a day later say that the cat died at the vet. But bam, you're just going to drop it right here. And the neighbor apologized and said he was sorry. There was a pause on the phone. And so then the guy down in Mexico said, how's mom, by the way? And the guy says, well, she's on the roof. Thought I would lighten things up here a bit. You can't handle the truth. We've got another movie quote here. We've been listing some of the best known 100 movie quotes of all time, matching them with some great passages of Scripture. Now, as we have found, some of these movie quotes we know really well. We know the movie it comes with. And then others, we have these movie quotes, and it's like, well, we've heard them, but we just can't figure out which movie it comes from. You can't handle the truth. How many of you know this line? A few of you. How many know which movie it came from? A few. A Few Good Men was the name of the movie. 1992, it starred Tom Cruise, Demi Moore, and of course the man who's saying this quote right here, Jack Nicholson. The story is that Jack is a colonel in the Marine Corps and Cruise is a lawyer prosecuting him because trying to get him to admit that Jack Nicholson's character ordered what is called a code red, which eventually leads to the murder of one of the Marine Corps grunts. And so the scene that we're about to see comes from that trial. And we see the interaction between these two.
You snotty bastard. Your Honor, I'd like to ask for a recess.
I'd like an answer to the question, Judge.
The court will wait for an answer.
If Lieutenant Kendrick gave an order that Santiago wasn't to be touched, then why did he have to be transferred? Colonel, Lieutenant Kendrick ordered the code red, didn't he? Because that's what you told Lieutenant Kendrick to do.
Object!
When it went bad, you cut these guys loose!
Your Honor!
You had Morgan's inside a bony transfer!
Your Honor!
You doctored the logbook!
Damn it, Captain!
Of course the doctor!
Consider yourself a contempt.
Colonel Jessup, did you order the code red?
You don't have to answer that question.
I'll answer the question. You want answers?
I think I'm entitled.
You want answers?
I want the truth!
You can't handle the truth. Son, we live in a world that has walls, and those walls have to be guarded by men with guns. Who's gonna do it? You, Lieutenant Weinberg? I have a greater responsibility than you could possibly fathom. You weep for Santiago and you curse the Marines. You have that luxury. You have the luxury of not knowing what I know, that Santiago's death, while tragic, probably saved lives, and my existence, while grotesque and incomprehensible to you, saves lives. You don't want the truth because deep down in places you don't talk about at parties, you want me on that wall. You need me on that wall. We use words like honor, code, loyalty. We use these words as the backbone of a life spent defending something. You use them as a punchline. I have neither the time nor the inclination to explain myself to a man who rises and sleeps under the blanket of the very freedom that I provide and then questions the manner in which I provide it. I would rather you just said thank you and went on your way. Otherwise, I suggest you pick up a weapon and stand a post. Either way, I don't give a damn what you think you are entitled to.
Did you order the code red?
I did the job.
Did you order the code red?
You're goddamn
like the scene from last week with Robert De Niro, I think Jack Nicholson is one of the few actors that could truly do justice with that part. I can't think of any other actor that can play this. It is well acted, it is well directed, and also kind of disturbing because we know that it leads to someone's death. Now today's lesson is not on the truth of the gospel. We're not going to be talking about that. It is not on what we believe to be true about Jesus or God. The truth lies in what we're willing to do to promote the message of Jesus and what we're willing to become to teach the gospel. In essence, are we willing to do all and be all for the sake of the gospel? I'm going to ask Steve here to give us an interpretation of what Paul says about this.
I don't know whether I can do this justice. I have no right to boast. Sorry. I have no right to boast just because I preach the gospel. After all, I'm under orders to do so. And how terrible it would be for me if I did not preach the gospel. If I did my work as a matter of free choice, then I could expect to be paid. But I do it as a matter of duty, because God has entrusted me with this task. What pay do I get then? It is the privilege of preaching the good news without charging for it, without claiming my rights in my work for the gospel. I am a free man, nobody's slave, but I make myself everybody's slave in order to win as many people as possible. While working with the Jews, I live like a Jew in order to win them. And even though I myself am not subject to the law of Moses, I live as though I were when working with those who are, in order to win them. In the same way, when working with Gentiles, I live like a Gentile, outside the Jewish law, in order to win Gentiles. That does not mean that I don't obey God's law. I am really under Christ's law. Among the weak in faith, I become weak like them in order to win them. So I become all things to all people, that I may save some of them by whatever means are possible. All this I do for the gospel's sake, in order to share in its many blessings.
Thank you, Steve. There's a story about a quaint New England village located on a cape that kind of jutted out into the Atlantic. The waters off the cape were dangerous to ships because of the undertow and the rocks that were there. And even though there was a lighthouse, there was still a lot of drownings, a lot of shipwrecks. And so people, all the times, they would get in their lifeboats and they would go out and save these people, or the many as they could. Well, after a time went along, they realized they needed to organize their efforts a little bit. And so they raised some money and they bought 2 lifeboats that were a good size so they can go out and save some of these people from drowning. Well, after a while, these lifeboats began to kind of get into disrepair. And so they felt it was best to maybe build a boathouse. And so they built a boathouse and to kind of store these lifeboats. And so when there was wrecks, they would go out into the boathouse and get into lifeboats and save the people and bring them back to the boathouse. But after a while, the boathouse kind of got in disrepair. And the paint, from the ocean was kind of washing off. And so they founded a treasury to raise some money to kind of take care of the boathouse and make sure that it was in good shape. And then eventually, after a while, when they realized they were getting a little bit older and the lifeboats were kind of uncomfortable, they decided to raise some money for a little bit better lifeboats, that things were a little bit more comfortable. And they didn't go out as often, because when they found is that these wrecks always seem to happen in the worst weather possible. And they weren't as young as they used to. And then they also noticed that when they would bring people back into the boathouse, they didn't leave in a very clean environment. It was kind of messy. It spent so much time kind of cleaning up the place. And so a vote was finally taken of this Lifesavers Club to end altogether any life-saving efforts. Instead, the members would get into the lifeboats twice a year, they said, on nice, warm, sunny afternoons and row around the cape and back into the boathouse, but as the story goes, no one else was ever saved. The truth of this passage, the truth for this church, the truth for the church, is that we must always be focused on what is the definition of the church. A few months back, we took our confirmation class on a field trip. And the pastor that we were visiting with, he sat down, he looked at the confirmands, and he asked the question, what is the definition of church? Why are you joining this institution? It was a great question, and I think really something that all of us need to answer at some point. So let's look at this question. What is the definition of the church? Is the church a building? Well, no. If you go out from this location and walk right over here, you're going to see a cornerstone. And on that cornerstone, you find 4 dates, which tells us that even though we've always been in this location, we've not always worshiped in the same building. In fact, as I look into this audience here, I see people that worshiped at the Scotts Bluff Church, and at the Gearing Trinity Church, and at Bayard, and at Melbeta, and Mitchell, and at other church locations. So the church doesn't necessarily have to be one single building. Here recently, I watched a news report about the United Methodist Church in Syracuse, Nebraska. 4 years ago, it burned down in a fire. And it was a news report, and they were talking about how they just moved into this brand new building. And it was great. They interviewed this one woman who was a member of the congregation, and she said, yes, we've been worshiping in former bars. We've been worshiping in the American Legion. And the best line was, wherever we could gather to keep the congregation together. You see, the church is not a building. Next question. Is the church a social welfare agency? When I was a pastor in Shadron, we had a wonderful program by these two individuals. Yulia was from Ukraine, and Eric was from Cameroon. Eric, they both worked at the college, and what they did is they talked about what church was like in their community. And what I remember about Eric, when he was talking about it in his country in Africa, is he said that the church buildings they had were not large enough for all the people that came to church there. And one of the persons asked the question, they said, why? And he said that the church sponsors hospitals, medical clinics, schools, and the people know what the church is doing. Now, the church in Cameroon and in other places of Africa is a social welfare agency. And that kind of sounds like our church 100 years ago. Some have said that we've lost that. Lauren sits on the hospital board here as a recognition that our church was founded by Methodists. Or excuse me, the hospital was founded by Methodists. I attended school at Nebraska Wesleyan, an institution that was founded by Methodists. And today in Cameroon, Eric says that the government is not in a position, meaning they don't have the money to sponsor hospitals, schools, clinics. They are the social welfare agency. This church has stepped up to fill that need in his country. Now, I've heard people say, well, we as a church really lost something by allowing the government to run welfare in this country. Now, I'm not going to debate that, but when I was in Shadron, I was the chair of Northwest Community Action Partnership, which meant that we oversaw a budget of $2.4 million. That was from everything from Head Start to weatherization to food for the hungry. And one of the things that I learned is that, especially when I moved down here, is that Northwest Community Action Partnership, or NCAP as it was called, that budget actually paled to other community actions around the state, especially to Capwin down here. So let's put that in perspective. $2.4 million. Is the church willing and able to raise the money to meet the budget of social welfare agencies in the community, and especially operating? Let's talk about the hospital. I was there present when the Nebraska Conference decided to sell our ownership in the hospital here. It was done mainly to because of the rising price of health care. Is the church willing and able to run and raise the money and operate the hospital? And now that I have a daughter that is in college and one that's getting ready, don't even get me started about the price of higher education. At one point, the church was really good at canoeing the river and being the social welfare agency for the nation. And in developing places like Africa, this is still the need. They're meeting this need. But the problem is these darn mountains. The church is not facing the 1800s. The church isn't even facing the 1950s. So does that mean that we should give up on our church building? Does that mean that we should stop helping out Capway? Does that mean that we should not be visiting the sick in the hospital? Does that mean that we should not be offering scholarships to our college students? In the words of Robert De Niro last week, heck no. So what is the church? I will tell you that I struggled with this definition. Maybe it has to do with my lineage. Many of you know that I'm a third-generation pastor. Maybe it has to do with who I am. I come to the church all the time. The church is just who I am and what I'm a part of. Even when I was out of the active ministry, I still attended church here. When Lauren and Bev retired from the ministry, they joined the church here. But I still struggled. What does the church mean? What is the definition of the church? I prayed about this, I thought about it, I tried to figure it out. And so I did what most people do when they try to figure out an answer. I went to the internet. And literally, when I typed in, what is the church? The first response that came up was this one. Many people today understand the church as a building. This is not a biblical understanding of the church. The word church comes from the Greek word ecclesia, which is defined as an assembly, or called out ones. The root meaning of church is not that of a building, but of people. It is ironic that when you ask people what church they attend, they usually identify a building. Romans 16:5 says, greet the church that is in their house. Paul refers to the church in their house, not a church building, but a body of believers. The church is the body of Christ, of which he is the head. Came from GotQuestions.com. What's interesting is in one of our Sunday school classes, we've been watching some lessons taught by the Atlanta-based pastor Andy Stanley. And he was talking about the lesson, Matthew 16:18, where Jesus tells Peter that upon the rock, Jesus will establish the church. And Andy Stanley's message is exactly that, found on the internet. Now I want us to do an exercise here. I want everyone to put up their hands like this, like you're holding up at the wall. Or maybe you're praying for me. Okay, now bring your fingers in, interlock the fingers like this. All right, now we're going to do a little exercise. I want everyone to do this. Go, here is the church, here is the steeple, open the door and see all the people. See, you know this. You've been taught this in Sunday school and Bible school. You know these lessons. As I said, we've gotten really good doing church for the 1800s. We know our brothers and sisters in the developing world is doing just that. They are the social welfare agencies of their country. And we're doing church really good for the 1950s. When we think of the church, we think of a building. We think of a place of worship, a place to come to. We can canoe this river. But there are mountains ahead of us. And we've never canoed a mountain before. And neither did Lewis and Clark. But they knew how to collaborate with the people around them. They knew maybe if we're going to get over those mountains, we need to ask them and find out what they did. And eventually they canoed in the Pacific Ocean. So, my question for you today is, who is turning to the internet? For questions, I want everyone to think of your age and minus 1,000. Everyone younger than you is turning to the internet for questions or answers. There you go. That might be a better image there for you. I'm guessing one could say if the younger generation is searching for the definition of the church, they have a better understanding, a more biblical understanding than maybe some of us. One of my favorite stories is about a young boy, a teenager. He had cancer. He was in the hospital, lost his hair through the radiation and chemotherapy. And when it was time for him to be released from the hospital, he was embarrassed. Embarrassed not because he was in the hospital, embarrassed not because of the blotches around his skin. He was embarrassed that he lost his hair. And so as he was being driven home, he knew that his friends were going to be there and greet him, and he didn't want to see them. And so he sat in the car in the driveway, and his mom convinced him he needed to get out of the car. And he could look in the house, and he could see that there was probably 30, 40, maybe 50 of his friends in there, and he was really nervous. But he went anyway, opened up the door. Everyone yelled, "Welcome home." And the best part is every single person, boy and girl, man and woman, shaved their head. goes to the very heart of the Greek word ecclesia, or gathering or fellowship. Every time the gathering of Christ comes together, we are the church. Every time we respond to someone in need, we are the church. Every time that we see someone that is hurting, that is lonely, we are the church. Every time that someone comes to this church and we say, thank you so much for being here, we welcome you, we are the church. Every time that we haven't seen someone in the past couple weeks and we contact them, either text message or the internet or just a phone call, we are the church. Every time that we sponsor and help out Capwing, we are the church. Every time that we raise food for the hungry, we are the church. The truth, I think we can handle the truth. One final story. A young woman by the name of Diane Williams, she's a 5th grade school teacher. One of her hobbies is skydiving. You will never find me doing that. Well, one day she was out there, she was doing something and doing something very unusual. She was in this group where each one had to hold hands as they were coming down from the sky. But something happened. She hit the backpack of one of the other skydivers, knocked her unconscious. As the story goes, this caused her to hurtle head over heels toward the ground like a ragdoll at a speed of 150 miles an hour. Fellow skydiver Gregory Robinson noticed that she was in trouble immediately. And so he did, let me get this right, he did what was called a vertical dart. Arms pinned to his body, ankles crossed, heads aimed at the ground, and what parachutists call a no-list dive. In effect, he became a human dive bomber, going at 200 miles an hour towards Diane. At 3,500 feet, about 10 seconds before impact, he was able to reach her, pulled her emergency ripcord, and then pulled his, and they both went to ground safely. When asked later about his heroic feat, he simply said, "We are here to help each other. That's what it's all about." The truth, I think we can handle the truth. The church is moving out of these walls because it was never intended to stay bottled up right here. It's the message Paul preached. It's the message Jesus presented to us. And it's the truth. And I think we can handle the truth. Amen. I'm going to ask our ushers to wait upon us now as we give back to God.